Good afternoon, everyone. I feel very happy and honored to be the keynote speaker at the opening of this conference hosted by the International Society of Public Law that takes place in this adorable city of Santiago de Chile. I want to thank you very warmly, Professor Rosalind Dixon, and Professors Lorenzo Cassini, Sergio Verdugo, Francisco Urbina, for the kind invitation. And I also want to extend my appreciation to my good friend, Richard Albert, and give him a special salute for Canada Day today, as you all know. I will base my presentation on an article that I wrote specially for this occasion, whose title is Technological Revolution, Democratic Recession, and Global Warming, the Limits of Law in a Changing World. And the talk is going to be divided in three parts, being a few lessons from the 21st century, transformations and afflictions of the 21st century, and part three, the challenges of our time, limits and possibilities of the law. And then each of these chapters will be divided in three topics. You probably all know that my native language is Portuguese and not English. And Rosalind, when you speak in a foreign language, you lose many of the rhetorical tools you have in your own language. And when this happens, you better have some ideas. And that's when the trouble starts. But I did my best, so we start with a few lessons from the 20th century. Two dystopias marked the 20th century's literature. The first one was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, published in 1932, between the First and the Second Wars. In this book, it describes a moment of optimism with the potential of technology. And Huxley's history tells a story in which the advance of biotechnology allowed for the construction of a hedonistic paradise with pleasures and self-indulgences that in fact concealed a dehumanized and authoritarian society. The second dystopia was George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, as the world was watching the growing power of the Soviet Union and the political appeal of communism. In his acclaimed work, Orwell described a frightening and depressing totalitarian state sustained by oppressive social control of citizens with censorship, surveillance, propaganda, and brutal repression. Fortunately, neither of these two dystopias came true. Nevertheless, both of them bring important warnings from the 20th century to the real risks of the combination of politics, authoritarianism, technology, and genetic engineering. The fortunate truth is that constitutional democracy has become, despite many fears and difficulties, the victorious ideology of the 20th century. Over the decades, it has defeated, one by one, the alternative projects that came forward: communism, fascism, military regimes, and Islamic fundamentalism. In this regard, Francis Fukuyama published in 1989 his famous article, The End of History, written when the Cold War was coming to an end and communism was in a process of collapse. According to him, to Fukuyama, liberal democracy, based on the rule of law, free market, individual freedoms, and right to political participation, was the culmination of the ideological evolution of humanity. Time would show that such prediction was more of a wishful thinking than a reality. But to end this topic, I can say in short that authoritarian dystopias did not consummate. Democracy prevailed in the turn of the 20th century to the 21st century, but history did not end. Still concerning the 20th century, which may not have been so brief, but it was certainly an era of extremes, to use Eric Hobsbawm's expression, one should note that the 20th century simultaneously had the mark of wars and genocides on the one hand, but also the consecration of human rights and democracy on the other. And it's undeniable that humanity began the 21st century in much better conditions than it had ever been. A realistic outlook will recognize advances in multiple domains under the light of Enlightenment ideas: reason, science, humanism, and progress, as Steven Pinker has shown in a book full of comforting data. We live more and better in a planet with fewer wars, less malnutrition and poverty, with greater access to knowledge, and more rights, including for historically discriminated groups as women, blacks, and gays. These civilizing advances suggest that we've been marching in the right direction, although not at the desired speed. Defeating extreme poverty and reducing inequalities between people and nations continue to be the unfinished cause of humanity. Still, though, it's good to overcome the feeling that the world is in decline, about to fall in the chaotic realm of misery, wars, revolution, terrorism, drug trafficking, as well as all kinds of intolerance and epidemics. There are times when the snapshot looks scary, but we must look at the entire film. And the last topic in this chapter, in a point of particular relevance to public law, the most important lesson, I think, from the 20th century is the decisive importance of institutions. Countries that built truly inclusive political and economic institutions achieve prosperity. Countries in which political and economic institutions are appropriated by extractive elites are doomed to poverty, or at best to middle-level income. The political and economic literature documents this finding, contrasting historical experiences such as England and Spain in the 17th century, or the United States and Latin America in the 18th century. The real reason for the success or failure of nations, as Acemoglu and Robinson have tried to demonstrate, and why nations fail, is not in geography, it's not in culture, it's not in ignorance of what's the right thing to do. It is in the way that institutions distribute political and economic power in society. The argument of the role of institutions is demonstrated with an emblematic example, that of Nogales, a city that's cut in half by a fence. And it sits part in the United States, in Arizona, and part in Mexico, in Sonora. Same geography, same culture, same people, but major differences in income, quality of services, level of security, and respect for the law. The cause for the differences is in the institutions. Similar comparisons contrast South and North Korea and West and East Germany until very recently. Extractive institutions have unfortunately prevailed in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and in Eastern European countries. Critical junctures, however, create a window of opportunity for the creative destruction of the old order and for institutional change. History is a chosen path, not a destiny that is fulfilled. Constitutional democracy and market economy, without concentration of power and without public or private monopolies, are usually the best environment for the flourishing of inclusive institutions. So now we move on to the 21st century, and we talk a bit about the transformations and afflictions of the 21st century, starting with the technological revolution. We live under the aegis of the third industrial revolution, known as the technological revolution or the digital revolution. The two previous revolutions are symbolized, respectively, by the steam in the 18th century and electricity in the 19th century as sources of energy. The digital revolution that started in the final quarter of the 20th century has allowed the massification of the personal computers, the massification of smart cell phones, and has connected billions of people around the world with the internet. So the worldwide network of computers is the symbol of this third revolution. And in fact, technological breakthroughs have revolutionized the way we live, the way we research, the way we buy goods, the way we book a plane, the way we listen to music. Totally. And I even made note here, Rosalind, we live under a new vocabulary, under a new grammar. It's amazing to see the amount of new terms that did not exist until the other day. And now they identify utilities without which we would no longer know how to live. Here are a few of them. Google. How could we live without giving a Google? WhatsApp. Telegram. It's become very dangerous in Brazil. Uber. Dropbox. Skype. FaceTime. Twitter. Instagram. Waze. Spotify. I got an email the other day from Spotify saying, the songs you like are these ones. Okay, thank you. Amazon, iTunes, Netflix, and YouTube. And for singles, there's also Tinder. The most valuable companies today are no longer oil companies like Shell or Exxon, or car makers like Ford or General Motors. or manufacturers of, is it mine? Could you please silence it? And manufacturers of equipment and appliances like General Electric. The most valuable companies today are the technology and data companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. Innovations and technological advances build this admirable new world of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, nanotechnology, quantum computing, autonomous cars, and the Internet of Things. Algorithm is becoming the most important concept of our time. And there are people already talking about the algorithmic state. By now, we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution as an unfolding of the digital revolution. Revolution between information technology and biotechnology, integrating the physical and the virtual, the human and the mechanical, and to some extent, redefining what it means to be human. In this scenario, public law is challenged to find answers to problems such as excessive concentration of economic power in few companies, fair taxation of tech companies, and, very scary, the disappearance of traditional jobs amid many other afflictions of our times. The second topic I want to talk about, the afflictions of the 21st century, is the crisis of democracy. As I stated before, democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century. Lately, however, something seems to be going wrong. A populist and authoritarian wave has swept the world, promoting what some authors have called democratic recession or democratic retrogression. Examples have been accumulating over the years. Hungary, Poland, Russia, Turkey, Georgia, Ukraine, Philippines, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, to name a few. The novelty, as many authors have pointed out, is that the recent erosion of democracy, it's not attributable, as it used to be, to military leaderships with their guns. The erosion of democracy has come in all these places by presidents and prime ministers that have been elected by popular vote. And then, gradually, brick by brick, comes the deconstruction of democracy with the concentration of power in the executive, curtailment of freedom of expression, persecution of opposition leaders, abuse of power by majorities in constitutional amendments or in enacting new constitutions, and the packing of Supreme Courts with submissive judges. There are, under my view, several causes for this authoritarian and populist wave. I try to organize them in three categories: political causes, socio-economic causes, and cultural identity causes. The political causes lie mainly in the crisis of representativeness of legislature. There is, in many parts of the world, a visible detachment between the political class and civil society. That's a worldwide phenomenon. And from the way I see it, the electoral systems have failed to give voice and relevance to citizenship. And for that reason, we live this moment of discredit of politics more generally. On the socio-economic side, we have in many countries very high rates of unemployment. And in other countries, although unemployment is not the problem, there is a lack of prospects for social ascent in a world dominated by globalization and the economy of knowledge and technology. And the third cause, many times is not perceived, but it's very important, and I want to point it out. There is a relevant contingent of people that do not profess the cosmopolitan, egalitarian, and multicultural creed that drives the progressive agenda, our progressive agenda of human rights, racial equality, feminist politics, gay marriage, defense of indigenous people, environmental protection, and drug decriminalization, just to mention a few modernities, a few modern social movements. These people felt disenfranchised, disempowered, and they are pushing the populist conservative wave. Two final remarks on this topic about democratic recession. First, one should not ignore the Chinese factor. An authoritarian alternative regime tainted by corruption, but of vertiginous economic and social success and the appeal it might represent. And secondly, one should not rule out the hypothesis that we're talking about democratic recession, but this is only a moment of a certain bitterness of progressive thinking due to the current prevalence of conservative values in many parts of the world. But this is democracy. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. Public law is being summoned to rethink structures that have aged and institutional designs conceived for another era. And then moving to our final topic in this second chapter, global warming. Climate change has been identified as the most relevant environmental risk of the 21st century and one of the defining issues of our time. Numerous authors have referred to the theme as the tragedy of the commons, a situation in which individuals acting with attention only to self-interest behave in a way that's contrary to the common good in the use of scarce resources. This is a major issue that has not been in the radar of many countries and many people. Two features of the climate debate make it harder to identify the proper actions that need to be taken. The first one is that although the vast majority of scientists recognize that this is a major problem and that human activities are the cause of it, there is still a great deal of ignorance and skepticism about climate change. And the second reason for the difficulty of bringing this debate forward is that the effects of the carbon emissions that we make today will only be really felt by the next generations in 30, 50 years, which has given incentives to postpone the urgent measures that should be taken right now. The central concept when dealing with global warming and with climate and with environment generally is still sustainable development. which has long been understood as the development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Global warming is associated with the greenhouse effect, which can be described as follows. I don't know if you feel like myself, I've always read about the greenhouse effect, so I went to really check what it meant so that I could explain people that are not really into this. And it's actually very simple. Solar energy reaches the Earth's atmosphere and is reflected back into space. Part of this energy, however, is trapped in the atmosphere by the so-called greenhouse gases, the most important of which is carbon dioxide. This is a natural and important phenomenon because it keeps the temperature in the Earth compatible with human life. However, human activities, notably the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as agriculture, livestock, and deforestation, have significantly increased the emission of greenhouse gases and the consequent retention of heat in the atmosphere. That's what we call global warming. And the consequences of this phenomenon are felt in all parts of the world, and they include, of course, the rise of the temperature, but also ocean warming, ice sheet melting in Greenland and Antarctica, glacial retreat, the loss of snow cover in the northern hemisphere, sea level rise, loss in the extent and thickness of the Arctic sea ice, the species extinction, and increasing number of extreme weather conditions such as hurricanes, floods, and heat waves. The major challenge for public law in this area is the need for transnational solutions involving the cooperation of all nations. This is because factors that affect the environment and climate on Earth, such as the emission of greenhouse gases and deforestation, they produce consequences that do not respect borders. Now we move to our third and final chapter, the challenges of our time, limits and possibilities of the law. Starting with some risks of the technological revolution and what can law do about it. The digital revolution and the developments that announce the fourth industrial revolution bring the allure of modern life as well as the promises of longevity and new comforts, but they come accompanied by inconveniences, threats, and real dangers to civilized life and to the human condition. Public law faces challenges that test its limits and possibilities. Here are three of them in what regards the technological and digital revolution. How to deal with freedom of expression on the internet in these times of hate speech, defamation, and disinformation campaigns. In the field of bioethics, several countries have regulated stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, and human cloning is generally prohibited. Commerce of human organs is equally forbidden, but it will eventually have to deal with the advances of regenerative medicine. Genetic manipulation is seen by most scientists as something inevitable in the near future. how to deal with the prospect of the creation of Superman, with all the risks of oppression and inequality that it could entail. Third, artificial intelligence is already being used by courts in different parts of the world, but it faces the suspicion that it can reinforce prejudices and discrimination because ultimately the machines would be fed with the dominant values, feelings, and impressions in society. How to avoid this? Of all the vicissitudes brought about by the technological advances, the risks to privacy have attracted the most attention by domestic and transnational legislators. In this matter of privacy, there are many questions to be considered. I want to highlight two of them. The first one refers to access to users' personal data. So we now have in the internet our name, our marital status, our profession, our tax returns, our debts, and then this all is accessible by tech companies. But besides that, and the second point I wanted to make, they also hold information about each person's behaviors, preference, interests, and concerns obtained from our online navigation that allow for micro-targeting and targeted advertising. So privacy has become a major issue, and it has been addressed in some jurisdiction. As you all know, the European Union has taken the lead in protecting privacy by enacting the General Data Protection Regulation that seeks to ensure that each individual has sovereignty over the data that concerns him or her, and this regulation requires prior consent for the use of this data. It grants the right of ratification, and it also grants the somewhat controversial right to be forgotten. In the United States, there's no national law regarding this matter. There are some bills in Congress being discussed. California has approved the California Data Privacy Protection Act, and in Brazil, which is the fourth largest country in internet users, with 181 million users, we just passed a law that's going to be effective in August of next year. Moving on to the second challenge of our time, talking about democracy and its internal enemies, I would like to highlight some factors that, under my view, threaten contemporary democracies. Three of them are: first, citizens' declining support; second, inequality; third, corruption. In what regards the decline in support for democracy, surveys in different parts of the world reveal the loss of prestige of governments founded on popular sovereignty. The reasons are many, and they reach the three branches of government. Sometimes people in the judiciary think that they're free from that non-appreciation of democracy. We are a package. We are all together in this project. And I think that regarding this decline in support for democracy, public law will need to invest energy in the search for an institutional design capable of reviving democratic institutions and mobilizing citizenship once again. Such innovations in the institutional design of democracy must include a review of the separation of powers doctrine that was conceived to a post-medieval and pre-industrial revolution world, it will also include a profound review of the forms of political representation, and of course it will need to consider the use of the worldwide computer network. In this regard, I want to make a note here. The expectation that the internet would become the comprehensive digital public sphere in a Habermasian view has not come true until now. In the real world, in many situations, what the internet has produced is the so-called tribalization or deliberative enclaves in which groups with strong and sometimes radical opinions speak only to themselves, along with disinformation campaigns and hate speech. The second factor that I think we need to consider in strengthening democracy is inequality. Inequality and poverty are dramatic marks of our times, the unfinished agenda of civilization. There are a variety of factors that reinforce them, inequality and poverty, and there's no magic solution. To confront them, though, quality education, efficient public services, and inclusive political and economic institutions constitute the universal recipe. Some countries have adopted the concept of an existential minimum or a vital minimum in order to ensure everyone access to education, healthcare, and social security. Other countries have brought to the Constitution a relevant set of social rights whose implementation constitutes one of the dramas of constitutional courts in various parts of the world, as judges from Brazil, Colombia, or South Africa can easily describe. In a successful book, Thomas Piketty sought to demonstrate that inequality is not an accident, but a characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, which can only be contained by state intervention. It's not being against free markets, but in favor of proper regulation of markets where that is called for. And finally, corruption compromises the values of democracy, undermining its credibility among citizens. Corruption has economic, social, and moral costs. Corruption kills. Many of the world's nations, including those most developed today, have at some point faced the vicious circle of corruption. Interestingly, although corruption is as old as humanity, only in the past decades it has really been perceived by the international community as something important that law must take care of. There are important treaties regarding corruption. Three of them are the Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials from the OECD, 1997, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and the UN Convention Against Corruption from 2003. And finally, efforts against global warming. Global warming stems mainly from human activities, as I said, such as the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. The phenomenon is global in nature, and solutions need to be sought at the international, regional, and national levels. They depend on the action and awareness of international organizations, governments, corporations, and individuals. The UN regime, the UN regime to address climate change rests on three pillars, very important. The Framework Convention from 1994, which establishes comprehensive principles, the Kyoto Protocol that establishes specific targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and, very importantly, the Paris Agreement, which came into force in 2016 and was joined by 185 countries, that, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, instead of setting binding emission limits, it predicted that each country would voluntarily submit its, quote, nationally determined contribution. It goes without saying that the whole picture is negatively affected by the decision of Donald Trump to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. And living in Brazil, one last note, the destruction of forests is one of the most dramatic chapters of environmental risks. In the Amazon, for example, in the last 40 years, an area corresponding to the territory of two Germanys has been deforested. If we continue at the current levels, tropical forests may disappear in the next 100 years. A general evaluation of the results of the Paris Agreement is expected in 2023, and there is little doubt that much broader efforts will be needed to achieve the proposed goals. We should note and emphasize that what is at stake here is intergenerational justice in order not to leave a degraded planet to posterity. There are even those who speculate about the need to colonize a space in search of other habitats. I read somewhere some time ago that George Washington made the shortest inauguration speech as President of the United States with 130 words, and that William Harrison made the longest inauguration speech with over 8,000 words pronounced in a very cold, freezing afternoon in Washington, D.C. William Harrison died 30 days later from a pneumonia he caught that night. And I've always thought of this episode as the curse that befalls people that talk beyond their time. So it's a good time to come to our conclusion. As we have seen throughout this presentation, public law has in its agenda the arduous task of, 1, neutralizing the negative side effects of the digital revolution and its unfoldings. 2nd, restoring the trust in democratic institutions and overcoming dysfunctions such as inequalities and corruption. And 3rd, effectively addressing global warming, the climate change. The unsurmountable truth is that the speed, the extent, and the depth, I could add, of the changes in contemporary world test laws, limits, and possibilities. And it's crucial that civilizing evolution and the ethical elevation of society come to its rescue. In a scenario dominated by asymmetries between countries, marked by globalization, transnationality of problems, and extraterritoriality of solutions, public law lives an important existential moment and is in search of new horizons. The 19th century was the century of private law, property and contracts. The 20th century saw the rise of public law, the advancement of the welfare state, and the expansion of democracies and of constitutional jurisdiction. The 21st century now deals with the expectations of a global society that demands, in relation to a variety of subjects, an equally global law. This is not a philosophical or a doctrinal choice, but an inevitability. In short, complex historical processes, such as those we are experiencing, are not linear. Amazing progress coexists with dramatic risks, combining fear and hope. The future is unpredictable. There are no prearranged roadmaps, and for that reason, we need to have goals that inspire and motivate us. Underlying the ideas of this presentation are some of them: the survival of humanity, peace between nations, preservation of democracy, sustainable development, seeking equal opportunities for people and nations, guaranteeing social safety nets for less fortunate people, and aid mechanisms for countries that have fallen behind. Finally, in a world where defeating death and colonizing space are discussions that are already on the table, the only safe compass is the perennial values shared since ancient times, among which are good, justice, and respect for others as cornerstones of the emancipation of people and the protection of human dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.